Scarlet Nexus is a game that contains time travel, a society where everyone has superpowers, evil twins, a cult of clones, absurd monstrosities that eat brains, and moon men. Despite everything negative I'll have to say about it, and trust me, there will be plenty, it's scientifically impossible for a game that has all of those things to be bad. I recently revisited it a few years after its release, and despite a constant barrage of flaws and mistakes, I was surprised at how much I still enjoyed the experience as a whole. Scarlet Nexus begins with a choice of protagonist. This choice actually matters, and I have a lot to say about it, but we'll come back to it later. At least early on, this choice doesn't change the story much. You open as a new recruit for something called the OSF, a military group comprised entirely of anime teenagers who fight weird monsters called Others. You're introduced to the world, a futuristic city where everyone has superpowers, but which is constantly under attack from those previously mentioned monsters. You get introduced to a whole bunch of characters who will serve as your party members and go on missions until the game throws like 5 different initial incidents at you all at once. At this point, the game splits off into the 2 separate stories for each of the protagonists, with the groups being in theory at odds with each other. This section doesn't do a great job of setting up the world. It feels like it's sort of rushing itself to make something interesting happen rather than letting the player come to grips with it before the plot goes bonkers. Between introducing a dozen characters all at once, explaining the basics of the setting, and introducing the combat and all the mechanics, there isn't enough time in the first few hours to do everything the game needs to before everything explodes. And boy does everything explode. As you might have surmised from the opening sentence, it's hard to talk even about the early part of the game because of how many twists and turns the story blasts through. I'll keep stuff to the earlier parts of the game, but I kind of can't talk about the problems with the story and the writing without bringing up specifics. The game splits after an incident where one of the main characters, Yuito, finds the other character, Kasane, standing over the dead body of his father. She then immediately tries to kill Yuito and then explains nothing and leaves. Kasane then becomes a fugitive who allies herself with a faction trying to take down the government. A government the game kind of forgot to explain is oppressive and hopes you just roll with it. As you might have surmised because you've seen literally any form of media before, Kasane didn't actually kill Yuito's father, and it's all a misunderstanding, which comes to the first major problem with the story. This entire middle section of the game where the story split only exists because they don't take the literal 2 minutes it would take to explain the situation to each other. This is one of my least favorite tropes in video game storytelling. Not only does it make things feel contrived, but it also relieves a lot of the tension because you know at some point they will stop and explain things. Even when the groups are at odds, you know there's zero chance they'll actually be long-term enemies. And speaking of the groups being at odds, this section also highlights another huge problem with the story. Scarlet Nexus is caught between 2 types of games, and it can't decide which one to be. The first is the aforementioned linear story where you find out about time travel and moon people, but the second is a Persona-style character-driven story where you have side cutscenes with your party members. You also give them books or something to make them love you, which is kinda par for the course. And when I say your party members, I mean every party member. Even during the middle section where theoretically the groups are trying to kill each other, you still have these social link style events with characters from the opposite group. This is a concept so fundamentally dumb that they bring it up at the beginning of each of these events, only to universally agree to just ignore the fact that they're mortal enemies for the next 5 minutes so they can talk about what boys they like or some shit. This also kills the pacing by pausing the story every hour or so to give you time to watch these. Every time something interesting happens, you're met with a big graphic that says standby phase and the flow is murdered. And these events then highlight the third major problem with the story, which is that the writing is just kind of bad. There's a lot of repetition and a lot of jargon, but my biggest issue is that everyone is just too fucking nice all of the time. Before really establishing who these characters are, the social events just turn into compliment fights or sessions where both participants are apologizing to each other for minor slights. Then there's the amount of times where characters almost instantly forgive each other for major things like, I don't know, killing their fucking dad and then trying to kill them. Characters just don't act realistically, and in turn conversations just don't flow smoothly. But despite all that, I didn't hate the story as much as I really should have. The characters are charming in their own way sometimes, and occasionally the game broke out of its tropes and made me genuinely smile. On top of this, the main plot is so batshit insane that it's almost interesting to watch just as a neutral observer, enjoying whatever crazy shit the game would throw at me next. With all that said, I saved my biggest story complaint for last, and that's the protagonist split. Having multiple protagonists in a game is something that's really hard to get right. You obviously want each route to feel unique, but at the same time, these are 30 to 40 hour long games, and having important or interesting things that you miss just because of an arbitrary choice at the beginning is a really frustrating feeling, especially when the non-story content is pretty much the same in both routes. An example of a game getting it right is Nier Automata, which has multiple protagonists, but each campaign unlocks after beating the previous, with the game taking that into account lengthwise and shortening each campaign. An example of a game getting it wrong is this game, to the point where I think there's a very specific and unintuitive way that you need to play this game to get the most out of its story. The beginning and ending sections are close to the same for each protagonist, but the middle section, which comprises about half of the game, splits off into completely separate stories with separate story revelations. Rather than incorporating these into each route, Scarlet Nexus goes for something so baffling that it's difficult to imagine how it made it into the game. Essentially, each group gets its own major story twist all to their own, both of which recontextualize a lot of what's happened up to that point. However, the way you learn about the twist from the opposite route is you meet up and they just explain it to you with no fanfare in non-cutscene text boxes. This is one of the worst examples of tell don't show I've seen in modern gaming, and as such, if you're playing it for the first time, I recommend playing both campaigns simultaneously up to this point. When you reach this section, which is where the stories reconverge, stop playing and play the opposite campaign up to the same point, then just play whichever one you want for the rest. The story has enough issues without handicapping itself like this, and this is sort of the nail in the coffin for enjoying it despite its flaws. The story simply makes too many mistakes to overlook. Scarlet Nexus is on the surface a relatively standard action RPG, but it succeeds in its combat by getting a lot of little things right as well as one really big thing. Let's cover that big thing first. I'm an absolute sucker for superpowers in gaming. It's why I still play Destiny 2 despite the fact that Bungie seems to genuinely hate all of its players. When executed correctly, the power fantasy from being able to do stuff I would dream about when I was 8 years old can carry a game, and Scarlet Nexus executes it mostly correctly. You control your protagonist and no one else, but at any given time you can activate one of your party members' abilities and use their powers alongside your own, which is psychokinesis. This means you'll always have the ability to do your standard action combat as well as fling rocks and cars at enemies, but you'll also be able to augment these abilities with things like lighting your attacks on fire, duplicating said cars, or going invisible to sneak up on enemies. The list of powers at your disposal reads like a superhero, once again designed by 8-year-old Ian, who could do everything. You have the aforementioned duplication and invisibility, you have super speed, invincibility, teleportation, and you can even double up on psychokinesis to fling even more cars at enemies. The effects of these powers are pretty basic to start, but through these Persona-style social links, you can unlock more things using that power. Once you reach the late game, each power will have its basic effect, an activated ability you can use whenever, a passive or two, another activated ability that will pop up during combat randomly, and oftentimes just another combo you can execute. A few examples of this are the ability to instantly break enemy shells by doing a perfect dodge, and the ability to just fire off a giant fire cyclone. The slow rollout of these abilities alongside a skill tree that unlocks some support skills, like another hit in the combo or the ability to aerial dodge, means the game is constantly throwing new stuff at you. It's certainly not perfect though. The enemies can get pretty spongy, especially the bosses. The level design is as basic as it gets, mostly just monster hallways with short side paths to get items. There's not much to do in these areas besides the story, as the side quests are extremely bare bones. It can also get pretty crazy as you get further on, with so many enemies that it's not reasonable to avoid all damage. But in the complete reverse of the story, it just does so many things right that I can overlook most of its mistakes. It's worth talking about the presentation in this game because while I'm supposed to be doing the whole game criticism thing here and telling you whether it's good or bad, this is a case where I genuinely have no fucking clue. The music varies between some pretty forgettable ambient stuff to some stuff that almost feels like it's missing instruments but somehow still works. The confusion continues into the cutscenes, which are presented in this weird comic book style. I wavered between this being bad due to how they make the conversations be pretty lifeless, and good because it's essentially a better replacement for the visual novel style a lot of games use, since compared to those, it's a lot more dynamic. The art style itself is fine. Like most anime-style games, it focuses more on the character models than the environments, but it gets the job done and has some interesting visual flares, like these weird red lines that are all over the place. The one thing I am certain on is the weirdly grotesque design of the enemies is awesome. Some of these things look like a lamp from A Christmas Story gained sentience and wanted blood. If I had to pick a lane for the presentation, I'd say it trends towards positive, but I have to imagine this is going to vary wildly from person to person. On this channel, I've covered games that were both greater and lesser than the sum of their parts. Stuff like Fire Emblem Three Houses and Shin Megami Tensei 5. Scarlet Nexus is an example of a game that is kind of exactly the sum of its parts. Despite the craziness infesting nearly every part of the game, from superpowered anime teenagers to time travel that makes no sense, it comes out the other side as exactly what it is on the surface. An action RPG with some pretty fun combat and a pretty stupid story. As I'm summing it up now, it doesn't actually sound that interesting, but it's still a game worthy of playing, even if it's just to gawk at the moon people. Thanks for watching. I'm working on a big project that will probably take some time to complete, but I'll try to get videos out as I'm making it. I do get a bit busier in the fall, so they will probably be shorter videos like this one, but I'll try not to go 3 months without posting again.